Hello and welcome to another edition of This Week in Jewish History. Today we're going to speak about an extremely consequential Jewish astronomer and historian named Abraham Zacuto. His role in Jewish history is especially important this week because we're commemorating the anniversary of Columbus's departure from Spain for the New World, and Zacuto's work was of signal importance in getting Columbus to the New World. So let's have a quick look at his life and work. So Zacuto his family originally came from Castile, and they migrated to Spain. Zacuto received his education at the University of Salamanca, and he spent much of his time studying astronomy in particular, although a good deal of his training was especially in the Jewish sciences, the study of Torah in particular. One of his teachers, besides his father, was the great Rabbi Abuab, the author of the Menorahs HaMaor, very important Kabbalistic work. He made his claim to fame primarily with the Chibur HaGadol, which is a translation of the term the big book, the great book, which is essentially a collection of highly accurate astronomical tables, which was later translated into non-Jewish languages and played an important role in a lot of the exploration that happened in the late 15th century. Columbus himself owned a copy of the Chibur HaGadol in obviously a language that he could read, and we have his marginal notations on the side, and he directly credits Zacuto with an exceptional event in his memoirs when he describes how he was taken captive by natives of some type at one point and was threatened with death until he used Zacuto's timetables to be able to accurately predict an eclipse, which of course demonstrated his superior knowledge and so on and allowed him to be saved. Zacuto's work also played an extremely important part in the travels of Vasco da Gama, and particularly his improvement of the engineering of the astrolabe, which was a device that was originally made out of wood. Zacuto switched to metals and also calibrated in such a way that it was possible to actually calculate one's position at sea far more accurately than had ever been done before, and ultimately led to the circumnavigation of the globe. Zacuto was, of course, highly regarded in his own lifetime for his astronomical work. He was the astronomer to the King of Portugal, actually, after he had been, along with the other Jews, expelled from Spain in 1492. He resided in Portugal. He is justly credited with the Age of Exploration. One of the emotions was the fact that a crater has been named after him. However, his life did not well in Portugal. He was exiled from there as well, along with the expulsion of all Jews in 1497. He made his way with great difficulty to Tunis, and then eventually to the Holy Land, where he is believed to have passed away in the year 1515. One of the most important aspects of Zacuto's work outside of his astronomy was the compilation of an amazing book called Sefer Yuchasin, which is a truly phenomenal 15th century history book that gives us tremendous insight into Jewish history as a whole. Well, that's it for This Week in Jewish History. I hope you found this interesting, and I wish you an excellent week. The idea is that on Sinai, the Jews reached a spiritual peak, and their sensitivity to the divine message was at its highest. And as the Talmud says, the Midrash actually, at Sinai, Lois households saw things that even the great prophet Ezekiel did not see. But ever since then, we have been slowly losing that ability to be sensitive to the divine message. We have been losing our level of spiritual ability to understand the meaning of these classical texts and so on, and we've been struggling to try and tread water all the way along. That does not mean that our intellectual skills have diminished, and in fact, this is not time to go off on a great digression here, but when it comes to halakhic decisions, that is, decisions referring to Jewish law, one must follow contemporary opinions, even though the earlier opinions, have this weight of being from an earlier generation. That said, it's not a slope downward, like step plateau, and the Jewish religious and intellectual tradition recognize several key periods of decline, and they correspond to, let's say, the following four periods that I've outlined on this. There is a period known as the period of the speakers. This refers to the what was written. It's a difficult term to translate it based on the word pride, so I've given the definition here. Glorious ones, great ones. You may have heard the term the Gaon of Vilna, or the Vilna Gaon. That's the how great. He was like one of them over a century later, or almost a century later, not a century. And then we have the period that we'll talk about today, that is of the Rishonim, the first ones. The word Rishon is used first, and that's roughly 950, although there's some, kind of pedantic disputable. And then finally, the period of the Acharonim, the later ones, which goes up to the year 1900, and it has not yet been determined what do we call tradition. Certainly, perhaps a few dozen, maybe 100. To choose three of the most famous, there are eight who lived in the 11th century. Here is an extremely accurate picture of Rashi. I'm just kidding. We have no idea if this is accurate, but it's a representation that's often used in iconic form. And I'll speak in the next slide a little bit about what was the kind of work that Rashi did. Secondly, he's known by the acronym of his name, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon. He lived in the following century, the 12th century. Here is a tradition I really like. This one is a question. It's kind of like what we look at the background. We have no idea the Rambam looked like this, but nevertheless. And finally, not a single individual, rather a school of Rishonim known as Tosafot, which means literally additions, and they are that's referred to as an here and a page of Talmud, great page, which is taken off the web. It's colorized here. Let's walk through it very quickly. We'll see where they fit. So the sort of core one in the center is Mishnah. This is the first page, and we spoke about the Mishnah in an earlier essential lecture. Directly below it in the center of the page, number 2, that is the Talmud per se. And then on the right are Rashi. And if you look closely, you'll see that in characteristic italic font that has been associated with Rashi script, although it's just a common font used as typescript and script written in the medieval period. Aggression. You'll see that the are bolded and others are not in bold. Regular font gives you an indication as to what Rashi is doing. Bold quotations from number one, number two from the Mishnah Talmud, and then his follows in kind of providing this incredible service, walking the reader through the text by phrase. 50 little comments that in economical use words an incredible aid to understand the Talmud. He also wrote it. Basic level, and Rashi is of course essential to the curriculum in modern Jewish schools. Then number 4 on the outside, and that's actually, they blocked out a lot of different things here, but the actual column that the number 4 appears in, which you can see is sort of like a C shape, and it wraps around the top of them a little bit, that's actually Tosafot to Rashi. Look carefully, you'll see that the amount of bolded text is much Rashi, because Tosafot is an entirely different function. Tosafot is analyzing the Talmud itself, rejections, comparing passages elsewhere in the Talmud to the spot on this page and so on, and really till then Rashi is the predecessor. Tosafot represents, several dozen scholars that lived through roughly the 12th through the 14th centuries, and their ideas are quite implication. Now, the other materials around side are various other commentators that go all the way from the 10th century up to, it looks like about the century is represented here. They perform various functions. You'll see my lecture on the Talmud if you're curious about this in greater detail, right, and so on. So those are 3 very basic famous Rishonim. There are dozens more. Now, what exactly did the Rishonim do? What is characteristic of this period in Jewish intellectual? Well, the first thing I've already alluded to in the previous slide, some of the Rishonim were incredible explainers. They took texts, often ancient texts like the Torah and the Mishnah, and they basically rendered them in more readily understandable Hebrew. Many of those texts are written not in Hebrew, they're written in Aramaic, for example, the Talmud is written in Aramaic. So there was a lot of confusion about the language itself, but more significantly, unpacking the arcane and coded nature of many of these texts, synthesizing the oral and the written tradition, that's especially something that Rashi did tremendously, and generally making the text, which at this point may have been over 1,000 years old, accessible to medieval readers. Nowadays, of course, the decline of generations is certainly true. Many of us require English translation to access the Rishonim who are helping us access the original text. But that's essentially what they're doing. If you want a contemporary example, Rashi was, so to speak, the art scroll of his day. That is a phenomenal compliment to art scroll. Right? Rashi was the mediator that made a lot of those ancient texts accessible to medieval readers. Secondly, very importantly, the Rishonim engaged in codification. And this is a larger topic. Basically, Jewish law, or halakha, is spread out throughout a massive amount of literature. It's throughout this huge Talmud. There are passages that are derived from the Tanakh, and of course from the Torah itself, and the commentaries of the Geonim. There are correspondence known as Shuvot and so on. And a lot of this material, is just too much for most people to keep in their heads. So therefore, a lot of the Rishonim, most famously perhaps Maimonides, brought all of this together and said, look, we're going to reorganize this, and we are going to space it out, give it chapter headings, give it subject headings, area that you find the commentators working on is they are analyzers. Um, for example, one of the areas in which the Rishonim expressed itself was the area of Binyan HaMitzvot, the counting of the commandments. The Talmud has a passage that says there are 613 commandments. Taryag Mitzvot, that's a lot more than the Big Ten, right? Judaism has a huge amount of them. And, like, thou shalt feel guilty. I'm not saying this. So they have all these commandments, but nowhere in the Talmud or in any other text were they ever actually listed. And so many of the commentators in the Rishonim period began to say, okay, well, let's get them all down. What are those 613 commandments? And so Maimonides and others filed these lists. There were some disputes over this is not actually a commandment, this is actually a suggestion, things like that. But basically, one of the major activities is counting on this one. And in particular, this book, here's a Hebrew edition published in the 20th century by Feldheim. The same work was written by a later Rishon, probably on Barcelona in the 15th century. This is a great book if you want it. Basically, what he did was he honestly wrote this book, Bar Mitzvah Fest. Oh my God! When I was growing up, Bar Mitzvah presents were fountain pens. My iPod, but generally got things like back then. It's amazing birthday present. Of the Torah, the five books of Moses as their week. Parshiot, the author lists the commandments, all heading up to 16, describes how they're performed, a little bit of historical background, and then really interestingly, he talks about why we have this commandment. This is an area of activity that most of the Rishonim shy away from, at least in print. They don't talk about, the commandments are there. God says do it, that's all there is to it. But the Chinuch was very interested in giving over to his son, as a bar mitzvah present, some why these commandments exist. And it's really fascinating reading the arcane. Fascinating reading, and definitely very worthwhile. Another philosophical activity that's extremely important is that of Maimonides. Again, we're mentioning over and over again because he is such a towering figure in medieval Jewish history. This is a picture, an illuminated manuscript of his Mora Nevuchim, his Guide to the Complex, in which the artist has depicted here Maimonides seated wearing, in which the manuscript is Mora Nevuchim, Guide to the Complex, in which the artist has depicted seated, instructing his students in philosophy. That's only a few of the Rishonim really engaged in an area with thought, which basically expands on this idea of why did God create the world the way it's created? Why do we have these obligations? How does it all work, and so on? And the more into one of these great philosophical works, for which, of course, Maimonides was heavily criticized by other Jews back in the 13th century. Not actually high Jewish. Basically, a quick overview. We've shown to understand them a little better, especially when we contrast them with the latest Acharon. The Rishonim have a pride of place, again, going back to that concept of Yeridat Hadorot, the decline of the generations, because they come earlier than the Acharonim, and their activity, particularly in cognition, explaining text and so on, it gives them a huge pride of place in traditional yeshiva, regular even. Acharonim, picking up afterwards, generally spend a lot of energy trying to explain the Rishonim. Adapting their, which are expressed in theory, to novel situations that are changes in social social norms, changes in economic realities, changes in technology in particular, are very much the activity of the Acharonim, trying to understand, for example, what does electricity mean when it comes to Shabbat? Can one use distance to fulfill a mitzvah hearing the shofar? Interesting things like this, or the domain of the Acharonim, and particularly the 20th century as well. A quick overview of who the Rishonim are and what they engage in, especially fascinating part of Jewish collection. Thanks very much for watching. Okay, thank you very much for coming. It was fantastic having you last week at the book launch. I really was very gratified by it. Anyways, thank you. Tonight's lecture on Ibn Gabriel is dedicated by Kay Wiggs, who wants to honor her grandfather, who always told her to look it up, by Mr. Ramiro Matos, and by Barb and Kellen Malikar in memory of Lou and Jenny Ehrlich. As I mentioned to you in a previous class, all of our lectures are actually subscribed. We've got people who donated to the Student Scholarship Fund for the lectures, and that's great. But what I especially like is the fact that people are still giving to the overall scholarship fund, which is amazing. So we've got a couple more anonymous grants of $100 and $101. We're now at $10,249, and we've got a few weeks left to hit $100,000. So we'll somehow make it. I also want to give a special thank you, as I mentioned, to those of you who came last week. It was really wonderful. We had a huge crowd. There was a lot of sushi that was consumed, a lot of cookies and things like that. And I think we had a meaningful experience talking about my new book, which is selling really well. I'm pleased to say it feels great to know that many people are appreciating it, and it's getting in the hands of readers who will enjoy it. Also, if you're interested in learning more, I will be having another book signing, this time in the Five Towns. So if you're out in Long Island this Thursday night, it's Kristallnacht. Of course, that's a very important date in the history of the Holocaust. And I'll be speaking about the new book in that context, and I welcome you to come on out or send your friends in the Five Towns to come see it. Okay, so let's go to the material per se. First of all, I want to say something general, and I have to say I'm a little embarrassed about this. You know, I have a PhD, and I've been teaching Jewish history for like 30 years now, and I always pronounce names wrong until about 3 weeks ago. Someone pointed out it's not even Gabriel, it was Gabiro, or Gabiro, the I in the wrong place. So I changed everything, but it's not even Gabiro, not Gabriel. It's embarrassing. I even said it to a rabbi, and the rabbi corrected me, and I felt humiliated, but it's good because it gets rid of my sins for Kippur. Anyway, so we're going to look at writings to having authored 20 books. Ironically, only two of them survived, and one of them was misattributed to another author for the last 1,000 years. We'll discuss exactly how it was discovered. He actually wanted to discover Hitler's work was rather fascinating. He lived a difficult life. He was orphaned as a young child. He found a patron, and then before he turned 20, the patron died. And he was regarded as a brilliant individual, a fantastic poet, and of course, in Spanish society, poetry was the acme of all virtues. So he had always an audience to attend to his poems, and he had customers for his poems when he was writing them for hire. But he was not well loved for his personality. He was known to be quite irascible, and the greats of that era all spoke of him as this kind of enfant terrible that was, very talented, brilliant even, tremendously prolific. They all had fantastic respect for his poetry and, as we shall see, for his philosophy, but they found his personality very difficult. Even the great Moses Ibn Ezra had some things to say about that. We'll see in a second. But it contributed to the fact that he died alone. He was never able to marry. He was never able to form that kind of relationship with a person, as far as we can tell. And even his supporters, like Shmuel Hanaki, we discussed earlier, wanted to keep him at arm's length because of his difficult personality makeup. Also, although he was a philosopher, as he was unable to control them and was easily led to ridicule great men and to set them to contempt in his writing. A little bit of a glimpse of the contradiction in Gabriel's personality, because we will read shortly just a little bit of his incredibly refined and passionate religious poetry, in which you see the depth of his personal tshuva, personal repentance, and his self-awareness in the poetic verse. But his contemporaries report that he had episodes of to get along with others. Here's from his own poetry. He writes, "When my anger is roused, heavens rumble with my thunder. I am not like them mellow words of bows and scrapes of humility." A little sense of there is some fire there in his personality. Yes, that's where he comes. Here's my favorite, though. Check this out. "My light is diffused, yet I am dirt beneath the feet of my truth." Meaning, if I love you, if you're one of my friends, I'll do anything for you. I'm like dirt between your feet. Just ask whatever you want, I will do it for you. To those who keep faith with me, and you won't find loyal or true sky raining fire in their heads. And this is in a letter he writes to his former friend. "Now that you have failed me, I undo the bonds of chip and will never stoop to men." It's like this person you don't want to cross, and see why you regard him as rather negative way. The same personality, the kinds of things that he wrote about this. It goes straight to the mistaken identity, because it's so. There is a great historical irony here in that the contrast between his elevated ethereal writings and his personal inability to control his anger. Really being outside of the major corpus of great Jewish writers in the area where he was most brilliant, which was his philosophy. Not so much his poetry, in my humble opinion. He's kind of like shunted away from Jewish trajectory for a couple of reasons. The first is the disappearance of, without question, his most famous work, which was called Poems tradition cites any Jewish sources behind it. It's written as if, it's just reason and scripture without, any of the rabbinic works, the Midrash, the Talmud, any of the Kabbalistic mystical writings. They're not present. Described. The Arab original did not survive vicissitudes of history. It was picked up by Jews in a significant way as a core text, like let's say, but so in the 12th century by one John of Spain. The only thing that we had hanging around that was sort of like was a 13th century Hebrew version, which only took so for many centuries until the it was looked at this work, which is in Latin, right?